We have here three gentlemen, three speakers who are going to talk about the same. Our next speaker is Vanney. He's going to talk about protection of elevators for building evacuation, code requirement, design and case studies. Please welcome Mr. Vanney.
Just want to say thank you for sticking through to the last presentation of the last day. I'm glad to see everyone here because I feel that everyone here is the ones that actually want to be here and will benefit from this presentation. I also want to say thank you to the two previous presenters. They've made my job very easy up here by going through a lot of the technical details, and I'll be able to skip over those in my presentation. One thing that I'll focus more on is overall code requirements and planning of super tall buildings and considerations, and then as well as going into some design practices, comparing different regions around the world, and I'll go into hopefully something that everyone finds is a little bit more exciting is for case studies from around the world, and you can see how these code requirements and design practices are put into place. So as I'd mentioned, we're going to go into the overall emergency of elevator protection. I'll discuss first the old way that we used to do it in the United States, and then I'll discuss the relatively new way that we're intended to do it in the United States, as well as comparing the European Union standards to the standards set in place in China, and then going forward into South Korea. And then I'll go into some case studies. I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with Jim on some of these exciting projects that he had mentioned, including BURJ Khalifa. The picture in this slide is a picture that I took from the 160th floor on somewhat of a hazy day, but you can see that there's no facade up yet, so it was a little windy and a little cloudy. But it was nice hearing Jim talk about some of the detailed requirements that reminisced. We finished up I think the design portion of our work in 2006, so it's not as fresh in my mind, so it was fun hearing about some of that. But then, as I mentioned, we'll go into some design considerations at the end and hopefully leave everyone at the end of the presentation something to consider, and hopefully we'll have a very good and fruitful discussion. So first I want to establish is the old way that we used to protect elevators in the United States, and I guess for largely throughout the United States it'll still be considered the old way until a lot of the jurisdictions adopt the new code. In the United States we have a code cycle that gets updated every 3 years, but a lot of jurisdictions delay the adoption of it because it's just too costly to adopt them every single code cycle. Some jurisdictions are still following 90s based codes, but for the time being nothing has changed significantly over the last decade until the 2009 editions of the code. One thing to keep in mind is that all these codes in here identify that in the case of emergency, elevators are not to be used as a means of egress, and that we should use the exit stairs. However, there are some few exceptions in model codes, one primarily for accessible means of egress for handicapped occupants who clearly cannot use the exit stairs. Now there are some allowances for stairs with very limited heights for handicapped occupants to be escorted downstairs, but it's really not feasible, especially in super tall buildings. Other requirements that Jim had gone through is Phase 1 and Phase 2 emergency recall from ASME A17.1, as well as other requirements such as standby power. I also did a comparison with NFPA 5000. NFPA 5000 is widely used throughout the Middle East, so that's why I included it in this. But essentially, the requirements are very, very similar to the IBC, which is predominantly used in the United States. Again, they do have exceptions for elevators to be used for handicap occupants, but they also include provisions for elevators to be used in towers, primarily air traffic control towers, where you have a very skinny base that comes up into a much larger area for the occupancy of all the equipment and the air traffic controllers. So there you're allowed to eliminate a stair if you can provide protected elevators. So here this just demonstrates a very poor layout of an architectural floor plan. You can see that fire protection consultant had developed this floor plan because there's no dead-end corridors. But one thing I want you to take away from this is that the stairs and the elevators have no relation to each other in this type of protection strategy. So both NFPA 5000 and the IBC do not require you to connect these two in any way, even when you're talking about elevators that are to be used for firefighter access into the building. Moving on into the European Union standard, Jim had touched on it briefly regarding a firefighter shaft. And essentially this is a 2-hour rated enclosure that not only provides a vestibule and a landing area for firefighters to stage operations, but it also provides a secondary means of access and escape via the stair that's directly connected to the vestibule. As Jim had mentioned, some limitations include a 60-second maximum travel time to reach all floors, which in BURJ Khalifa is not possible, especially when you consider that a single rise elevator is not possible in the building. You need to have transfer floors, and that's consistent with many super tall buildings. I can't think of any that I've worked on that haven't had a transfer floor, and really you'd be limited to, and these guys could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but 100 stories at the very maximum, maybe a little bit more, maybe a couple more floors after that, depending on the height of the building. But in addition to that, they're also looking at additional requirements for the protection of elevators, including waterproofing provisions. And consistently with the U.S. standard is that firefighters are not to be used as a means of egress. So we're going over into the Chinese standard, and Jim had mentioned that there's some similarities between the European Union standards. But if you look at the configuration, they do require a vestibule for the elevators. However, the vestibule is not required to be shared with the stair. It can be, but it's not required. Another very interesting requirement that isn't present in the U.S. codes or the European Union standards is that the fire lifts need to be within 30 meters of an exterior building so that the fire service can get in and easily access the lifts without having to transport their equipment long horizontal distances before they get into the lifts. Consistent with the European Union standards, the 60-second travel time, waterproof equipment. One unique requirement is they have a requirement for waterproof vestibules. This is usually accomplished by just a raised landing in this vestibule to prevent any water that's discharged in the corridor from getting into that vestibule. Again, no allowance for egress. And now we get to the South Korean standard. Again, very similar. You can kind of see that the layout's getting similar, getting the same. But there's a fairly unique requirement in this is that they actually restrict you from sharing a vestibule. You are not permitted to share a vestibule except for in residential buildings. So that's something that's quite unique. But again, you still see some similar requirements. Rated vestibule with 30 meters to the exterior for the fire's lift, secondary power. They do require provisions for providing some form of smoke protection, usually accomplished by pressurizing the vestibules. Again, no allowance for egress. So finally, we have the updated version of the IBC and subsequent NFPA 5000, which are fairly similar. The 2009 IBC is the first edition that actually allows you to use elevators for evacuation. I've listed all the requirements here, and so we can take some time and go through and read them all. I'm not going to make everyone read them all. I'll summarize the points fairly quickly because we've already had some discussion on the new requirements. But one thing that I really want to point out and I want to stress, and it's going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the rest of the presentation, is the implementation of elevators to be used in evacuation in this code. It relies on a self-evacuation. The case studies that Jim had given us, they're phased evacuation, controlled by building management. I'll go through some case studies and you'll see a very a similar strategy. But they do say that we need to have a fire safety and evacuation plan. Well, all of our other buildings have a fire safety and evacuation plan. Our question still is, how do we create a fire safety and evacuation plan if we're using a self-evacuation where occupants can do whatever they want? So going into the actual protection of it and some of the planning issues that come along with it, this is something that any architects in the crowd are going to want to pay attention to, is the size requirements for the vestibule. Vestibules can be fairly small. Typically, when you're looking at a firefighter shaft, you're looking at a service vestibule that's really only sized to accommodate services coming in and out. Well, now you have an actual requirement based on the occupant load of your floor. So, for example, let's say you have a decent-sized floor plan with a restaurant in it, and you have a couple of 1,500 millimeter stairs. You're getting occupant loads up around 400 occupants. Well, you need to accommodate at least 100 occupants within this vestibule. And so when you start adding up the numbers and you start figuring out how much space you need, plus you need to add a wheelchair space, now you're looking at a vestibule of about 36 square meters, which if you're planning a core and you're already into detailed design in your project, that may cause you to actually have to redesign your entire core. And I'm sure these guys up here can relate to that. Redesigning a core in a super tall building is a very, very painful process, primarily for the architects, but we feel it as well. One thing that is one of the drivers for allowing a self-evacuation is this new dynamic signage. Jim had previously indicated that you'll have a sign that's in every elevator lobby that says you cannot use the elevators during a fire, you should go use the stairs. Well, now there is no sign at all in normal operations. If the fire alarm in the building goes off, the sign turns to a green sign that reads that elevators are available for occupant evacuation. If phase 1 emergency recall is initiated, then the sign turns red and says that elevators are out of service, use the exit stairs. Now, I want to go back to this quick slide. If you're going through this in your head on evacuating a building that has this feature, obviously to get to the stair and to get to any exit, you're going to have to go into this vestibule. You wait for the elevators to be crawled, and the sign's green, so you can wait. Signs turns red. Well, when the signs turns red, then you can still identify that you can no longer use the lifts, and you have a direct access into the stair, so you no longer have to go back into the fire zone. Another enhancement that's required is that each of these doors, from the corridor to the vestibule and the vestibule into the stair, each has to have a vision panel of wired glass so that you can see smoke accumulating in each space, and you can see any fire spread to identify that those spaces are untenable before actually entering into those spaces. And there's a number of different other requirements in terms of elevator monitoring, and I'm sure these guys up here are much more know much more in detail about these requirements. But essentially, making sure that we're monitoring the elevators to make sure that they're continuing to be safe during the course of an evacuation prior to that phase 1. If any of the things, if any of these monitoring systems indicate that the lifts will become unsafe, the elevator is taken out of service for evacuation. Some other specific requirements relating to fire protection is in the International Building Code, high-rise buildings are required to be sprinkler protected throughout. When employing this type of evacuation system, there are some exceptions for sprinkler protection to make sure that water does not increase the risk of using these elevators during an event. So, for example, in the machine room, typically you're required to have a shunt trip. You're no longer required to have this shunt trip. In addition to something that we've seen in the Chinese standard way of protecting the vestibules, is that water protection is required. Now, you're thinking, why would anybody ever want to do this strategy? We've designed super tall buildings in the past, and they've worked, and we've done it. However, the International Building Code 2009 edition has a number of other enhanced requirements other than just elevator evacuation. One of them, and probably the most painful for architects, developers, building owners, is when you start reducing their leasable floor area. And one of the big items is any stair that's now over 420 feet or 126 meters is now required to have a third dedicated stair for firefighter access. This stair cannot be used for a means of egress. Therefore, if you are thinking that you can add a third stair and you can increase the occupancy of your building and you get those benefits, no. You basically need to add this third stair without any other benefit than protecting firefighters. So you can get alleviation from this requirement by implementing this elevator evacuation system. And now, one difference that is something to point out between IBC and NFPA 5000. NFPA 5000 hasn't implemented that requirement for the third stair, so if you are applying NFPA 5000, you don't have to sweat it just yet. But if you do have a fire protection consultant on your team that wants to use elevator-assisted evacuation or a vertical transportation consultant, they have added all the same requirements into Appendix E. So it's something that with code officials you can at least refer to a set of standards, even though they're not technically enforceable within the document. So now that you have the full basis of elevator protection, I want to go back and highlight the comparison between all of them. And it's something in the United States and going through school and from now on, I'm just going to call it BURJ Dubai in this presentation so it can be consistent. But some things I want to highlight that Jim had left out was an additional protection of having CCTV surveillance cameras installed within each shaft on top of a lift so that prior to the fire service or building staff undergoing a phased building evacuation, they can shuttle the elevator up and down the shaft to make sure that smoke hasn't entered the shaft, fire hasn't entered the shaft, and that the shaft hasn't been compromised, just adding an additional level of protection. For Burj Khalifa, we've promoted that elevators can be used as a means for evacuating the building in a full building evacuation, but we have not relied on them in one bit for the designs and the means of egress system. So essentially, if we're going to evacuate this building, we can rely 100% on the stairs and the areas of refuge if something were to happen and the elevators were not capable of being used. So just to put it in perspective, how long would it take to evacuate the BURJ without any lifts? Well, we did a comparative analysis with EMAR to determine how many lifts they would like to upgrade to be used. We did our based calculation and found that it's going to take about 2.5 hours to evacuate the BURJ. And that's an ideal situation, assuming that people are actually physically fit to evacuate. And we knew that that wasn't going to be a solution, so we had to come up with something else. So we went through and we did the comparative analysis and employing elevators in conjunction with using stairs, and we were able to reduce the evacuation time by almost 50%. So we're really looking at about an hour and a half evacuation time. But keep in mind, we've also designed the fire and life safety system so that fire really isn't our highest priority or our biggest concern for a building evacuation. We're assuming that fire will only really be exposing building occupants on a floor, if not 3 floors. We're really more concerned about prolonged power failures, weather-related events, human-related events. So these are the things that we're really planning for. The second case study is the Stratosphere Tower. The Stratosphere Tower has been designed to the 1991 UBC. The UBC was combined with 2 other codes in the United States to form the IBC. But you look at this tower and it looks kind of like an air traffic control tower, but if any of you have been to Vegas, Nevada, you'd recognize this as not a air traffic control tower, but instead it's a high occupancy space with restaurants and an amusement park. The picture here is one that I took, the lower picture, which is actually an amusement ride. It's not a telecommunication tower. It's an amusement ride that occupants get strapped into seats facing out over the city, and they get shot straight up into the air and brought back down. Other features include a roller coaster that hangs off the edge of the building. So this is a rather unique case study because it does rely on elevators to evacuate the building. There are 3 evacuation elevators plus 1 firefighter's elevator. Some of the strategy that they've employed prior to even the 2009 edition of these requirements coming on board, 18 years before, was raised elevator door thresholds, emergency power. One thing that they did do to increase the reliability of the systems is implement 2 independent machine rooms to make sure that if there was an incident that affected one machine room, the other machine room would still be protected, and that at least we're not compromising all of the elevator evacuation, just at worst 2/3 of it. There's 2-hour fire resistance. There's curbs to control sprinkler water going into machine rooms. The elevator shafts are ventilated from smoke. Here are some examples of the floor plans. The upper image, or the upper floor plan, shows like a typical floor with a rated vestibule. The vestibules have independent pressurization, as I mentioned, 2-hour rating. Something that's a little bit more unique and something that we're seeing in the super tall buildings is this implementation of an area of refuge. The area of refuge strategy has been a long-standing strategy found throughout China and Singapore, and has been implemented in the majority of the world's super tall buildings. This one, however, is even further enhanced. It's the 2 lowest floors of the upper portion of the tower, and it's separated from the tower by 3-hour floor construction. It's open to the exterior, so it's naturally ventilated. And because this is an assembly occupancy space, people have to purchase tickets to enter this space. The tower occupant load is limited so that the occupancy within the tower can only be equal to or less than the number of occupants that could be evacuated in 1 hour using the elevators. So in this example, trade-offs were taken from elevators. But again, similar to BURJ Dubai, is that the evacuation is intended to be managed. It's not a self-evacuation. Occupants come down to this floor. You can even see on the lower floor plan that there's already queuing lines that have been established to queue occupants into these elevators. So going into another case study that's similar to the codes that we used for BURJ Dubai. This is a super tall tower in Doha. Now, in this strategy, we were able to integrate quite seamlessly, similar to the STRATOSPHERE tower, the areas of refuge floors and the evacuation elevators. You can see the stair has 2 doors, one door entering the area of refuge and the other door then proceeding down the stairs. So occupants are forced to, or are encouraged to identify the area of refuge as being a place where they can rest and wait instead of continuing down the stairs, freeing up the stairs for other occupants who are capable of proceeding down. Or they can come around and they can queue for the lifts that are then directly accessible from the elevators. Now, this corner of the floor is mirrored onto the other corner of the floor as well. In this building, however, similar to BURJ Dubai, is we did not take any trade-offs for elevators, so the stairs have been sized to accommodate the occupant load for the tower. But again, it's the phased evacuation managed by building staff. And the last example I wanted to give you was the South Korean case study. This is a super tall project in Incheon, where you can see the Korean standard being enforced, where you have separate vestibules, one for the stair, one for the elevators. They did not require the stair to be broken as it has been, but we insisted that the stair provide a way into the vestibule and back out of the vestibule, and we can create signage there to identify the area of refuge. And then you can see that even though the vestibules aren't able to be shared per code, we're able to share them with a rated construction via the area of refuge. And then the corridor that you see going around the shaft opening goes then over to another area of refuge, which is the same configuration on the other side of the floor. And in this case, technically trade-offs weren't taken for elevators in terms of an overall fire strategy, but in terms of the Korean building code, trade-offs were taken because the Korean building code does not allow residential stairs to share stairs with any other occupancy. In this building, the residential occupancy was at the top of the building with restaurants above them and office below them. We would have required to have 8 stairs in the building because there's 2 separate towers, which really wasn't sustainable. So I guess in the end of the day, we did take a trade-off. So summarizing, going through and reviewing the case studies, we can identify some of the similarities. They all have enhanced protection of the elevators. They're all have protected vestibules with emergency power and means for limiting the inflow of water into the shafts. Some of the differences, BURJ Dubai used staging areas, which were sky lobby floors, whereas other projects used staging floors combined with areas of refuge. In addition, different methods for monitoring the elevator system and the shaft integrity. And then another big difference we can see is the levels of trade-offs that we've taken for implementing the strategy in these buildings. One thing that I want to point out, though, one of the biggest similarities that you'll see is all of these case studies used managed evacuations and are planned to have phased evacuations where in a normal alarm we're only going to evacuate 3 stories, maybe 5 stories at most in the building, going down to an area of refuge where they'll wait until the alarm gets cleared, the fire gets extinguished. And all of these case studies used evacuation after phase 1 recall has been initiated in the elevators. So if the fire alarm were to go off, elevators would be recalled. Civil defense, fire authority, whatever terminology the building uses, they can enter the building, identify where the fire is located, use the lifts to go and fight a fire, or they can prioritize to going directly to an area of refuge and facilitating evacuation from that space. So this is a very big difference to what's being implemented in the 2009 IBC and NFPA. So if you look at some of the design considerations that I'd like to leave you with, so when each of you are working on your next high-rise building, more than 40 floors, or who knows, maybe India will have the first 200-floor building. It's yet to be determined, but something to consider early on in the design stage is that you have to balance your trade-offs, find what's the appropriate balance. If you are required to go above and beyond a 2-stair configuration for a building, you may consider having elevators being substituted for that 3rd stair. But one of the biggest drivers should always be that in the end of the day it's going to reduce your evacuation time for a building and can provide a very safe way. The signs that have been posted in every lobby were put in place when protection strategies were not as elaborate and sophisticated as they are today. And stairs can still be relied upon, but may not be the safest mode of transportation when you can implement a lift strategy. As Jim had mentioned, when you're looking at evacuating anything over 30 or 40 floors, regardless of how fit you are, you're going to start feeling fatigue, and that's when you're increasing your risk for occupants getting injured. And the last thing you want is occupants in your building getting injured on false alarms. That's when lawsuits are going to come in and public relations is going to go down, and it's not going to be very sustainable for the building itself. And the last design considerations go to the actual overall evacuation strategy. If you are working on a current high-rise building, your fire protection consultant can certainly help you out on this. If you don't have a fire protection consultant, feel free to give me a call and I can assist. But you really need to establish early on what are you going to do if you're going to do a pre or post phase 1 evacuation. And that decision should be made based on a number of different building characteristics. It could work for a residential building of about 60 floors or less, where you have a very low occupant load. You could fit potentially an entire floor into a single elevator or 2 elevators. But you need to work with your vertical transportation consultants to make sure that they've set those priorities in advance so that the elevators aren't stopping at multiple floors. You don't get the instances that Jim had mentioned of overloading elevators or occupants not letting the doors shut, those types of things. And then, most importantly, and the architects should definitely take note, is make sure that you're accommodating your strategy in the design. The core should be designed after these things are considered, because if the core is designed and you have to come back and revise it, that can be a very painful process, which was something that we had to do on BURJ Dubai, but it wasn't due to this omission. It was due to a change in occupancy at a later stage in the project. I think Jim had a very difficult day when he was told that he needed to redo all of his vertical transportation, or basically flip it upside down. And the floor area should be planned to accommodate the areas of refuge. So I hope that this has sparked interest in a number of you, and I hope that we can have a very fruitful discussion for whatever's left during the session. And I appreciate you guys sticking around, and I appreciate you guys being relentless, and I hope everyone enjoys the weekend.